Between 1847 and 1851, 9 plantation owners across central Alabama died in their beds with identical injuries: crushed windpipes, no signs of struggle, and a single detail that terrified every slaveholder in the region: their bedroom doors were locked from the inside. The victims owned a combined total of over 400 enslaved people, but investigators found something peculiar in each estate's records. Every single one had recently purchased or traded for an unusually tall field hand whose name appeared in ledgers simply as Jacob. No family name, no age, just Jacob. No. And here is what the authorities never put in their official reports. 7 of the 9 victims had their tongues severed post-mortem and placed in their own hands. The remaining 2 were found with their mouths stuffed with cotton still attached to the bowl. Local newspapers called it a plague of nighttime apoplexy. The planters knew better. They knew someone was coming for them, one by one, and they had no way to stop him. Before we continue with the story of Big Jacob and the terror that swept through Alabama's plantation country, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you are about to hear has been buried in courthouse basements and private family archives for over 170 years. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments. I am curious how far this story travels. The investigation into these deaths would ultimately involve 3 sheriffs, 2 federal marshals, and more than 60 armed vigilantes. Yet not a single arrest was ever made. What they discovered instead would force them to confront a truth more terrifying than any they had imagined. Lowndes County, Alabama, in the decade before the Civil War, was a place where cotton was king and human beings were currency. The rich black soil of the region produced some of the finest cotton in the South, and the men who controlled that soil wielded power that extended far beyond their property lines. They sat in state legislatures, they controlled county courts, and they decided who lived and who died with a casualness that would shock even the most hardened observer today. The plantation belt that stretched from Montgomery to Selma was dotted with grand estates, each one a small kingdom unto itself. Men like Cornelius Vaughan, Thaddeus Reinhardt, and Josiah Grantham owned not just land and slaves, but the very infrastructure of the region. They financed the railroads, they owned the cotton gins, they held mortgages on smaller farms and could ruin a man with a word to the right banker in Mobile. But in the summer of 1847, something changed in Lowndes County. A tall man, impossibly tall by the standards of the time, began appearing at slave auctions and private sales throughout the region. The man stood somewhere between 6'9" and 7'2", depending on which account you read, with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to fit through standard doorframes. His skin was described in sale documents as dark mahogany. His hands were said to be the size of dinner plates, and his eyes, this detail appears in nearly every description, were pale gray, an unusual trait that made him immediately recognizable. His name, according to the bill of sale from a Savannah auction house dated June 12, 1847, was Jacob. No surname. The document listed his age as approximately 28 years, though the auctioneer noted that this was an estimate, as the man himself refused to speak. The word mute appeared in the margin of the sale record, underlined twice. The buyer was a man named Cornelius Vaughan, owner of Sweet Gum Plantation, a 2,000-acre estate 12 miles south of Hayneville. Vaughan paid $850 for Jacob, nearly double the going rate for a prime field hand, but he considered it money well spent. A man of Jacob's size could do the work of 2 normal laborers, and his muteness was seen as a virtue rather than a defect. A slave who could not speak, could not organize, could not spread discontent, could not testify against his master in any meaningful way. Vaughan brought Jacob back to Sweet Gum in chains, though contemporary accounts suggest the chains were more for show than necessity. Jacob walked with a strange calm, his massive frame moving with a grace that seemed at odds with his size. The other slaves at Sweet Gum, 93 men, women and children according to the 1847 property inventory, watched him arrive with a mixture of fear and fascination. What Vaughn did not know, could not have known, was that Jacob had been sold 6 times in the previous 14 months. Each time he had been purchased by a wealthy planter. Each time he had been resold within weeks, sometimes days. And each time the seller was not the original buyer, but the man's widow or surviving family members. The pattern was there in the records, clear as day, but scattered across 3 states and a dozen auction houses. No one had bothered to connect the dots. No one had thought to ask why a prime field hand kept returning to market. No one had wondered what happened to the men who bought him. Sweet Gum Plantation in 1847 was one of the crown jewels of Lowndes County. The main house was a Greek Revival masterpiece with 6 columns across the front portico, built from brick fired right there on the property. Cornelius Vaughn lived there with his wife Margaret, their 4 children, and Margaret's elderly mother. The family employed 3 white overseers, 2 house servants who were light-skinned enslaved women, and maintained a staff of field hands divided into 3 gangs based on their physical capabilities. Vaughn himself was 52 years old, a second-generation planter whose father had moved to Alabama from South Carolina in 1818. He was known throughout the county as a stern but generally fair master by the standards of the time, which is to say, he used the whip less frequently than some, but used it nonetheless. He attended the Methodist Church in Hayneville every Sunday, served on the County Board of Commissioners, and had twice been elected to represent Lowndes County in the state legislature. But Vaughn had a reputation among the enslaved community that extended far beyond what the white population knew. He was known as a breaker of spirits, a man who took particular satisfaction in crushing the will of slaves who showed signs of independence or pride. He never sold families together if he could avoid it. Separating mothers from children, husbands from wives was, in his view, the most effective way to prevent bonding and potential rebellion. Jacob was assigned to the first gang, the strongest field hands who worked from before dawn until after dark during cotton season. His first week at Sweet Gum, he picked more cotton than any 3 men combined. His second week, the overseer, a man named Randall Peck, made the mistake of assuming Jacob's silence meant submission. Peck struck Jacob across the back with a hickory cane for moving too slowly during a water break. It was a routine punishment, the kind delivered dozens of times a day across thousands of plantations. But Jacob did something unusual. He stopped moving entirely. He did not cry out, he could not, being mute, but he turned his head slowly and looked directly at Peck with those strange, pale grey eyes. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Jacob returned to work. Peck would later tell others that he felt something in that moment, something that made his bowels turn to water. He never struck Jacob again. The other slaves began to notice things about Jacob. He never ate with the others. He would take his ration of cornmeal and salt pork and disappear into the woods at the edge of the plantation for an hour each evening, returning only when full dark had fallen. Some of the older women whispered that he was praying. Others said he was planning. A few suggested in voices barely above a breath that he was remembering. On the night of September 3rd, 1847, exactly 83 days after Jacob arrived at Sweet Gum Plantation, Cornelius Vaughn went to bed at his usual hour of 10 o'clock. His wife Margaret had retired earlier, complaining of a headache. The house was quiet, the children asleep in their rooms on the 2nd floor, the elderly mother-in-law snoring gently in her ground-floor bedroom. The next morning, at 6:30, Margaret Vaughn found her husband dead in their bed. The scene that confronted Margaret Vaughn that September morning would be seared into her memory until her own death 40 years later. Her husband lay on his back in their 4-poster bed, his eyes open and bulging, his face a mottled purple-gray color that she initially mistook for shadow. His mouth was open wide, as if he had been trying to scream, but his tongue was gone, severed cleanly at the root. The tongue itself was placed carefully in his right hand, which had been positioned across his chest. But it was his throat that told the true story. The skin was unbroken, but the damage beneath was catastrophic. The county physician who examined the body 3 hours later would write in his report that the hyoid bone was crushed. The thyroid cartilage was shattered, and the larynx was compressed so thoroughly that it had nearly flattened against the spine. The doctor estimated that the pressure required to inflict such damage would have been enormous, far beyond what any normal man could apply with his hands. The bedroom door was locked from the inside. The key was still in the lock. The windows were latched shut. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication that Vaughan had fought against his attacker. The bed linens were barely disturbed. Most unsettling of all was the cotton. Scattered across the pillow near Vaughan's head were 7 cotton bolls, still attached to bits of stem and leaf. They had been placed there deliberately, arranged in a semicircle around where his head had lain. The cotton had not come from inside the house. Margaret kept no raw cotton in the main residence. Someone had brought it in from outside. The investigation that followed was perfunctory at best. Sheriff Thomas Braddock arrived at Sweet Gum by mid-morning with 2 deputies. They interviewed the family, the white overseers, and a handful of house slaves. Everyone had the same story. They had heard nothing during the night. No screams, no sounds of struggle, no doors opening or closing. The house had been silent. Braddock's working theory, shared with the Vaughan family that same afternoon, was that Cornelius had suffered some kind of apoplectic fit, a sudden seizure that had caused him to bite through his own tongue and somehow damage his own throat through violent convulsions. It was thin reasoning, but it allowed everyone to avoid contemplating the alternative. That someone had entered a locked room and murdered one of the most powerful men in the county without making a sound. The funeral was held 3 days later. Half the county attended, including every major plantation owner within 20 miles. As was customary, the slaves from Sweet Gum were required to line the road as the funeral procession passed, heads bowed in a performance of grief that few felt. Jacob stood at the back of the group, his head level with everyone else's despite being several yards behind them. He did not bow his head. He watched the coffin pass with those pale grey eyes, his face expressionless, his massive hands hanging loose at his sides. 3 weeks after Cornelius Vaughan's death, Margaret Vaughan sold Jacob to a planter named Thaddeus Reinhardt, who owned a 1,500-acre estate called Fairhope Plantation in Montgomery County, about 30 miles east of Sweet Gum. The sale price was $600, a significant loss on the original investment, but Margaret wanted the giant mute slave gone. Several of the field hands had begun to whisper that Jacob was somehow responsible for her husband's death, though none could say how or why. The whispers made her uncomfortable. Reinhardt was delighted with the purchase. He had heard about the enormous slave who could pick cotton like a machine, and $600 seemed a bargain. He put Jacob to work immediately in his fields, where the man once again proved his worth by outperforming every other slave on the property. Reinhardt was 60 years old, a widower with 3 grown sons who managed various aspects of the plantation's operations. He was known as a harsh master, quick with the whip and quicker with punishment. Slaves who displeased him might find their rations cut in half for a week, or be forced to work in leg irons, or be denied their 1 day of rest on Sunday. Jacob worked without complaint, his silence making him the perfect target for Reinhardt's cruelty. The old man seemed to enjoy ordering the giant slave to perform demeaning tasks, making him kneel to receive instructions, forcing him to bow his head in the presence of white visitors, striking him across the face for imagined offenses. On the evening of October 27, 1847, Thaddeus Reinhardt went to bed alone in his second-floor bedroom at Fairhope's main house. His sons lived in separate cottages on the property, each managing their own section of the plantation. The main house, aside from Reinhardt himself, was occupied only by 2 elderly house slaves who slept in a lean-to attached to the kitchen building, separate from the main structure. The next morning, Reinhardt's body was discovered by one of his sons, who had come to the main house for breakfast. The scene was identical to what had been found at Sweet Gum Plantation. Crushed throat, no signs of struggle, door locked from inside. But this time, there was no severed tongue. Instead, Reinhardt's mouth had been stuffed full of raw cotton, so much cotton that his cheeks bulged and his jaw had been forced open wide. Cotton fibers were found deep in his throat, though the physician who examined the body confirmed that suffocation was not the cause of death. The throat had been crushed first. The cotton had been added after. This time the news spread faster. Within days, every planter in central Alabama had heard about the two deaths and their disturbing similarities. Sheriff Braddock traveled to Fairhope to investigate personally, and it was during this investigation that someone finally made the connection that should have been obvious from the start. Both men had owned a slave named Jacob. Both men had died within weeks of acquiring him. And according to the bill of sale found in Reinhardt's study, Jacob had been purchased from the widow of Cornelius Vaughan. Braddock immediately ordered Jacob to be found and questioned. But when the overseer went to the slave quarters that evening to retrieve the giant mute field hand, Jacob was gone. His sleeping space, a rough pallet in one corner of a cabin he shared with 8 other men, was empty. No one had seen him leave. No one had heard him go. He had simply vanished sometime between sunset and full dark. A search party was organized immediately. 20 armed men on horseback, with dogs borrowed from a neighboring plantation, combed the woods and fields around Fairhope for 3 days. They found nothing. No tracks, no trace, no sign of which direction Jacob had fled. But Braddock was a thorough man, and something about the case nagged at him. If Jacob was the killer, and the circumstantial evidence certainly pointed that way, then why had he been sold in the first place? Why had Vaughan's widow let a murderer slip through her fingers? Braddock began to dig into Jacob's history, requesting information from auction houses and plantation records across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Jacob had been sold 9 times in the previous 18 months. And in 8 of those 9 cases, the buyer had died within 12 weeks of the purchase. The only exception was a small farmer in Georgia who had bought Jacob but sold him 2 weeks later after the man claimed the slave made him uncomfortable. The farmer was still alive. 8 dead men, 8 identical causes of death, though scattered across such a wide area that no one had connected them until now. 8 locked rooms, 8 crushed throats. And in 7 of those 8 cases, some form of mutilation involving the tongue or mouth. Braddock compiled his findings into a report that he sent to the governor's office in Montgomery, urging immediate action. He described Jacob in detail: the unusual height, the pale gray eyes, the absolute silence, and warned that the man was likely still in Alabama, probably still killing. The response from Montgomery was swift and unequivocal. Find Jacob and hang him, but do it quietly. The last thing Alabama needed in 1847, with tensions over slavery reaching a fever pitch across the nation, was a public spectacle of a slave who had murdered white men and evaded justice. It would send the wrong message to the enslaved population. It would frighten white families. It would, in the words of one state official, undermine the natural order. So the hunt for Big Jacob, as he had come to be called, was conducted with as much secrecy as possible. Rewards were posted in county courthouses, but not in newspapers. Descriptions were circulated among sheriffs and slave patrols, but not published for the general public. And plantation owners across central Alabama began taking precautions, locking their bedroom doors, keeping loaded pistols on their nightstands, having their most trusted house slaves stand guard outside their rooms at night. None of it would matter. The winter of 1847 was one of the coldest in Alabama memory. Ice storms swept across the plantation belt in December, coating the cotton fields in a crystalline layer that made them look almost beautiful, if you could forget the human misery that had produced the crop beneath. Work slowed to a crawl. Slaves huddled in their unheated cabins, burning what little wood they could scavenge to keep from freezing. And in the main houses of the great plantations, white families drew closer to their fireplaces and wondered if the silent killer was out there somewhere in the frozen darkness. 3 months passed without another death. Sheriff Braddock began to hope that Jacob had either fled the state or died in the wilderness. It was not uncommon for escaped slaves to perish from exposure or starvation. The Mississippi Territory was unforgiving to those who knew nothing of wilderness survival. But then, on February 9, 1848, a planter named Josiah Grantham was found dead in his bed at Elmwood Plantation in Dallas County. Same crushed throat, same locked door, same cotton bolls arranged around his head. Grantham had owned 112 slaves, and among them, according to his most recent property ledger, was a field hand acquired just 6 weeks earlier in a private sale. The seller's name was listed as E. Reinhardt, one of Thaddeus Reinhardt's sons, disposing of his late father's assets. The slave's name was Jacob. The pattern was now undeniable. Jacob was not fleeing. He was circulating. He was allowing himself to be sold from one plantation to another, and each time he killed his new owner before disappearing and arranging to be sold again. How he managed the logistics of these sales, how he communicated with sellers, how he ensured he ended up at specific plantations, remained a mystery. But the fact of it was irrefutable. What Braddock could not understand, what kept him awake late into the night, was the method. How was Jacob entering locked rooms? How was he killing these men without waking them, without causing them to struggle or cry out? And most importantly, why was he doing this? What possible motive could drive a man to such calculated, methodical murder? The answer to that last question would come from an unexpected source. An elderly enslaved woman named Bethany, who lived on a small plantation in Perry County. Bethany was known throughout the region as a healer and a keeper of stories. She was in her 80s, an extraordinary age for an enslaved person in that era. And she had been born in Africa, brought to South Carolina, as a young girl on a slave ship. When word of the killings reached Perry County, Bethany asked to speak with the local sheriff. It was an unusual request. Slaves did not typically volunteer information to white authorities, but Bethany was respected even by the white population, who valued her medicinal knowledge. The sheriff agreed to meet with her. What Bethany told him was this. She had known a man matching Jacob's description 40 years earlier in South Carolina. He had been a young boy then, maybe 7 or 8 years old, already unusually tall for his age. His mother had been brought from West Africa, from a region where the people grew taller than anywhere else on the continent. His father, according to Bethany, had been the white overseer of the plantation where they lived, a brutal man named Samuel Colton who took what he wanted from the slave women and thought nothing of it. The boy, Bethany remembered him being called Jacob, with a K, had been mute from birth, but he was not deaf, and he was not stupid. He understood everything, he watched everything, and according to Bethany, he learned early on that his silence made him invisible to white people. They talked freely in front of him, never thinking that he might remember their words. When Jacob was 10 years old, his mother died under suspicious circumstances. She was found one morning at the bottom of the stairs leading down from the overseer's house. Samuel Colton claimed she had fallen while bringing him his breakfast. No one believed him, but no one dared challenge him either. 3 days later, Samuel Colton was found dead in his bed. His throat had been crushed, though no one could determine how. The boy Jacob had been sold away immediately afterward. The plantation owner wanted no part of what he suspected had happened. Bethany had lost track of Jacob after that, but she had heard rumors over the years, a mute slave who moved from plantation to plantation, always seeming to arrive right before tragedy struck. Some people thought he was cursed. Others thought he was a ghost. Bethany believed he was something else entirely. A man who had learned how to kill, and who had decided to use that knowledge to settle accounts. Sheriff Braddock listened to Bethany's story with growing horror. If she was right, then Jacob was not acting randomly. He was targeting specific types of men. Plantation owners, overseers, men who held power over the enslaved. Men who, in Jacob's eyes, deserved to die. But that still did not explain the how. How did a man, even a man of Jacob's size and strength, enter a locked room and kill someone without being detected? The answer to that question would come from an unexpected witness. a 7-year-old boy named Thomas Grantham, son of the recently murdered Josiah Grantham. Thomas had been having nightmares since his father's death, terrible dreams of shadows moving in the dark, of something vast and silent standing over his bed. His mother had dismissed the nightmares as grief and trauma, but one evening, about 3 weeks after the murder, Thomas told her something that made her blood freeze. He said he had seen the giant slave, the one called Jacob, standing in the hallway outside his father's bedroom on the night of the murder. But Jacob had not been walking down the hallway. He had been crawling along the ceiling. The boy's mother immediately dismissed this as fantasy, the product of a child's terrified imagination. But something made her mention it to the sheriff when he came to check on the family, and something made Braddock take it seriously. He returned to Elmwood Plantation and examined the hallway outside Josiah Grantham's bedroom with fresh eyes. The ceilings in the main house were 12 feet high, built in the grand southern style. The hallway was long and narrow, with doors opening off either side. And when Braddock looked up, he saw something he had missed on his first examination. There were marks on the ceiling beams, subtle indentations in the wood, positioned at regular intervals, as if something very heavy had been pressed against them. The marks led from the servants' staircase at the far end of the hallway, all the way to Grantham's bedroom door. Braddock stood in that hallway for a long time, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he walked to the servants' staircase and looked up. The staircase was narrow and steep, built for the house slaves who tended to the bedrooms, and the ceiling above it was lower, perhaps 9 feet high instead of 12. A man of Jacob's height and reach could, in theory, brace himself between the walls of that staircase, using his hands on one side and his feet on the other, and climb upward without ever touching the steps. Once at the top, he could continue moving along the hallway ceiling in the same manner, hands and feet braced against opposite walls, body suspended above the floor. It seemed impossible. The strength required would be inhuman. But then again, Jacob was not a normal man. His size, his silence, his patience, everything about him suggested capabilities beyond the ordinary. And if he could move along the ceiling, he could position himself directly above a closed door. He could wait there, motionless, for hours if necessary. And when the door finally opened, when his victim inevitably had to use the chamber pot or fetch water in the night, Jacob could drop down like a spider, crushing the man's throat before he had time to scream, then dragging the body back to the bed and staging the scene. The locked door was meaningless. Jacob had never needed to open it. He had been inside the room the entire time, waiting above the doorframe where no one thought to look. Just when you think this story cannot get any darker, consider this. If Jacob could move unseen through the most secure parts of these plantation houses, how many times had he watched these families sleep? How many nights had he spent suspended above their beds, deciding who would die and who would live? The horror in Lowndes County was not just in the deaths themselves, but in the realization that Big Jacob could have killed anyone, at any time, and no locked door or armed guard could have stopped him. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next, because the truth behind these murders is even more disturbing than you imagine. Sheriff Braddock's theory about Jacob's method of entry and attack was shared with a select group of lawmen and plantation owners in March of 1848. The reaction was skepticism mixed with terror. Skepticism because the physical capabilities required seemed beyond belief. Terror because if Braddock was right, then every plantation house in Alabama was vulnerable. Measures were taken. Ceilings were examined for marks. Hallways were patrolled at night. Some plantation owners went so far as to have additional locks installed on their bedroom doors, or to seal the gaps between door and frame with rags to prevent anyone from observing them from outside. But the precautions were ineffective because they were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Jacob's pattern. The plantation owners assumed he would strike quickly after being purchased, as he had with Cornelius Vaughn and Thaddeus Reinhardt. They were on high alert for the first few weeks after acquiring any new slave, but as time passed without incident, they relaxed. Jacob had learned patience. His next victim, a planter named William Sturtevant of Wilcox County, owned Jacob for 4 full months before dying in his bed on June 12, 1848. Sturtevant had taken every precaution Braddock had recommended. He had his hallway ceiling examined weekly. He kept 2 loaded pistols within arm's reach of his bed. He had his most trusted house slave, an elderly man named Moses, sleep on a pallet outside his bedroom door. None of it mattered. On the morning of June 13th, Moses woke to find Sturtevant dead in his locked bedroom. The cotton bowls were arranged around his head. His tongue had been severed and placed in his hand. And when investigators examined the ceiling, they found fresh marks that had not been there during the previous inspection 3 days earlier. Jacob had somehow gained access to the house, positioned himself above Sturtevant's bedroom, and waited for his moment. When it came, he struck with the same cold efficiency he had shown in every previous attack. The death of William Sturtevant marked a turning point in the investigation. Up until then, there had been a hope, however slim, that Jacob might be captured or killed. But now it became clear that conventional methods would not work. Jacob was not just physically formidable, he was intelligent, patient, and utterly committed to his mission. Governor Reuben Chapman, responding to increasingly frantic appeals from the plantation community, authorized the formation of a special patrol dedicated solely to finding and eliminating Jacob. The patrol consisted of 20 armed men, all experienced slave catchers led by a professional bounty hunter named Marcus Pettigrew. The bounty for Jacob, dead or alive, was raised to $5,000, an enormous sum that reflected both the danger Jacob posed and the desperation of Alabama's planter class. Pettigrew was a lean, hard man in his early 40s, originally from Tennessee. He had made his living for 20 years tracking down escaped slaves and returning them to their owners. He claimed to have personally captured more than 300 runaways, and he had never failed to bring back a fugitive once he took the contract. He was also known for his cruelty. The slaves he captured often bore scars from his methods. But in the spring of 1848, the plantation owners of Alabama did not care about his methods. They only cared about results. Pettigrew began his hunt by studying every known detail about Jacob's movements. He obtained copies of all the bills of sale, traced the route Jacob had taken across Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and interviewed dozens of people who had encountered the giant mute slave. What emerged was a picture of a man who was not acting randomly or impulsively, but following a deliberate pattern. Every man Jacob had killed shared certain characteristics. They were all wealthy plantation owners with large numbers of slaves. They were all known within their communities as harsh masters, who used the whip freely and broke up slave families without hesitation. And in several cases, they had personal connections to each other, business partnerships, family relationships, shared investments in slave trading ventures. One name kept appearing in the background of these connections: Samuel Colton, the overseer who had been found dead in South Carolina 40 years earlier. Colton, it turned out, had not simply been an overseer. He had been a slave trader on the side, buying and selling slaves for personal profit. Several of the men Jacob had killed had done business with Colton in the 1820s and 1830s, purchasing slaves that Colton had acquired through means that were questionable even by the standards of the slave trade. Bethany's story about Jacob, the mute boy whose mother had died under suspicious circumstances, began to take on new significance. If Colton had been involved in Jacob's mother's death, and if some of Jacob's victims had been Colton's business associates, then Jacob was not killing randomly. He was working through a list. He was executing a plan that he had been carrying out for 40 years. Pettigrew realized that if he wanted to catch Jacob, he needed to think like Jacob. He needed to determine who would be next on Jacob's list. So he obtained records from slave trading firms that had done business with Samuel Colton in the 1820s and 1830s, cross-referenced them with current plantation owners in Alabama, and came up with a list of 11 names. 8 of those 11 men were already dead. The remaining 3 were Nathaniel Harwick of Butler County, Isaiah Drummond of Choctaw County, and Preston Devane of Marengo County. All 3 were immediately warned and placed under protection. Pettigrew divided his patrol into 3 groups, with one group assigned to watch each potential victim. For 6 weeks, nothing happened. The plantation owners began to hope that Jacob had fled Alabama or died in the wilderness. Pettigrew's men grew bored and complacent, spending their evenings drinking and their days sleeping off hangovers. Then, on August 2nd, 1848, Nathaniel Harwick was found dead in his bed. Crushed throat, locked door, cotton bolls arranged around his head. His tongue had been severed and placed in both hands, folded as if in prayer. The patrol that had been assigned to protect Harwick had been stationed outside his plantation house all night. They swore that no one had entered or left the building. They had checked every door and window at regular intervals. They had even examined the ceiling of Harwick's bedroom hallway twice during the night. And yet, Jacob had killed him anyway. The realization hit Pettigrew like a physical blow. Jacob had been inside the house before the patrol arrived. He had been waiting, somewhere in the structure, possibly for days. He had the patience to remain hidden and motionless for as long as necessary. And he knew these plantation houses better than the white families who lived in them. How could he know them so well? The answer came from an unexpected source, a plantation ledger found in Harwick's study. The ledger listed all of Harwick's slaves by name, age, and assignment. And there, in a section labeled Recent Acquisitions, was an entry dated June 20th, 1848. Jacob, male, approx 30 years, mute, field hand, purchased from W. Sturtevant estate sale, $400. Jacob had been living at Harwick's plantation for 6 weeks. He had been working in the fields during the day, sleeping in the slave quarters at night and waiting for his moment. When the patrol arrived and began their watch, Jacob had simply hidden himself somewhere in the main house, the attic perhaps, or a seldom-used storage room, and waited for the inevitable moment when vigilance would waver. Pettigrew realized that he had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Jacob was not a fugitive slave running from plantation to plantation. He was allowing himself to be sold, moving through the system that had enslaved him, using that system against itself. He was invisible because he was exactly where he was supposed to be, working in the fields, living in the quarters, performing the labor expected of him. And when the time came to kill, he simply used the access that his enslaved status gave him. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The death of Nathaniel Harwick sent shockwaves through Alabama's planter class that exceeded even the panic caused by previous murders. The realization that armed guards and locked doors provided no protection, that Jacob could be living and working on their own plantations without their knowledge, created a paranoia that verged on hysteria. Plantation owners across the state began scrutinizing their slave populations with new suspicion. Any unusually tall slave, any slave who seemed too quiet or too observant, any slave who had been recently purchased or acquired in trade, became a subject of intense scrutiny. Several slaves who fit Jacob's general description were arrested and interrogated, though none proved to be the man Pettigrew was hunting. Isaiah Drummond of Choctaw County took the most extreme precautions. He had every slave on his property examined by a physician, looking for any sign of the pale gray eyes that witnesses had described. He fired all 3 of his overseers and hired new men from outside the state, reasoning that Jacob might have corrupted his previous staff. He moved out of his plantation house entirely, taking up residence in a hotel in the town of Butler, 20 miles away, and visiting his property only during daylight hours, always with armed escorts. Preston Devane of Marengo County took a different approach. He announced that he was selling his entire slave population and leaving Alabama permanently. He would liquidate his holdings, he declared, and move to Texas, where he could start fresh without the threat of Jacob hanging over his head. The estate sale was scheduled for September 15, 1848. Notices were posted in newspapers across the South, advertising the sale of 147 slaves, along with land, equipment, and livestock. Buyers began arriving at Devaine's plantation a week before the sale date, examining the slaves and making preliminary bids. Among the slaves to be sold was a field hand named Jacob. Devaine had purchased the man 8 months earlier from an estate sale in Wilcox County, the estate of William Sturtevant, the man who had died in June. Devaine had not made the connection at the time, but when he reviewed his property records after Harwick's death, he found the purchase entry and immediately sent word to Pettigrew. Pettigrew arrived at Devaine's plantation on September 10th with his full patrol of 20 men. They found Jacob working in the cotton fields, moving down the rows with mechanical efficiency, his massive frame bent over the plants. When the patrol approached, Jacob straightened and regarded them with those distinctive pale grey eyes, his expression utterly blank. Pettigrew had brought chains, heavy iron shackles that would have been sufficient to restrain any normal man. But when his men attempted to place the chains on Jacob, something unexpected happened. Jacob did not resist. He did not fight. He simply stood still and allowed the men to approach. But as the first man reached out to grasp Jacob's wrist, Jacob did something that made every member of the patrol take an involuntary step backward. He smiled. It was not a natural expression. His lips pulled back from his teeth in a way that seemed almost unfamiliar to his face, as if he had learned the mechanics of smiling from observation but had never truly felt the emotion behind it. And in that smile, Pettigrew saw something that chilled him more deeply than any of the crime scenes he had examined. Jacob wanted to be captured. This was part of his plan. Pettigrew, to his credit, did not lose his composure. He ordered his men to chain Jacob's hands and feet, then to chain him to a post in the center of Devaine's stable yard, where he could be observed from all sides. Guards were posted in shifts, with strict orders that at least 4 men must have Jacob in sight at all times. Under no circumstances was anyone to approach him alone. For 3 days Jacob stood chained to that post. He did not eat the food that was placed near him. He did not drink the water. He did not sleep. Or if he did, he slept with his eyes open, because the guards reported that his gaze never wavered, never closed. He simply stood there, that faint smile on his face, watching. On the 3rd night, something happened that would become the subject of debate and speculation for years to come. One of the guards, a man named Luke Farris, reported that he had seen Jacob's chains beginning to glow in the darkness. Not brightly, just a faint reddish luminescence, as if the metal itself was heating up from within. Farris called out to the other guards, and all 4 men on duty that night later swore that they had seen the same phenomenon. By the time Pettigrew was roused from his sleep and arrived at the stable yard, the glow had faded. But when he examined the chains, he found that the iron was warm to the touch, and that the links nearest Jacob's wrists showed signs of stress, hairline fractures running through the metal. Pettigrew had the chains replaced immediately, using fresh iron fetters that had been forged specifically for Jacob, with links twice as thick as normal. And he doubled the guard, placing 8 men around the post instead of 4. The next morning, September 14th, the day before the scheduled estate sale, Pettigrew made his decision. Jacob would not be brought to trial. There would be no public spectacle, no opportunity for the enslaved population to see one of their own defy the system and survive. Jacob would be hanged at dawn, right there in Preston Devaine's stable yard, and his body would be buried in an unmarked grave. Word of the decision spread quickly among the slaves on Devaine's plantation. By evening, a strange tension had settled over the property. The slaves in the quarters were unusually quiet, gathering in small groups and speaking in whispers. Several of the overseers reported feeling uneasy, though they could not articulate why. Preston Devaine himself, despite his earlier decision to leave Alabama, decided that he wanted to witness Jacob's execution. He would stay 1 more night, he announced, and see this threat ended once and for all. Then he would complete his preparations for departure. That night, Devaine retired to his bedroom on the 2nd floor of his plantation house. Pettigrew offered to post guards inside the house, but Devaine refused. Jacob was chained and under constant observation in the stable yard, more than 100 yards from the main house. There was no possible way he could pose a threat. Devane locked his bedroom door, loaded his pistol, and placed it on his nightstand. Then he climbed into bed, and for the first time in weeks, slept soundly. He woke sometime in the deepest part of the night to the sensation of pressure on his chest. In the darkness, he could not immediately identify what was causing the sensation. He reached for his pistol, but his hand encountered only empty air. The nightstand was somehow beyond his reach. Then his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw what was pinning him to his bed. Jacob's face hung directly above his own, so close that Devane could feel the warmth of the giant man's breath. Those pale gray eyes reflected what little moonlight filtered through the window, giving them an almost luminous quality. And Jacob's hands, those massive, impossibly strong hands, were wrapped around Devane's throat. Devane tried to scream, but no sound emerged. He tried to struggle, but Jacob's weight was immovable. He tried to understand how this was possible, how Jacob could be here when he was supposed to be chained in the stable yard, but his oxygen-starved brain could not process the impossibility of what was happening. The last thing Preston Devane saw was Jacob's smile, that same unnatural mechanical expression, widening slightly as the pressure on his throat increased beyond the point of endurance. In the stable yard, the guards maintained their watch around the post where Jacob was chained. The giant mute slave stood exactly as he had for the past 4 days, his eyes open, his posture unchanged. The guards noted nothing unusual, and their reports would later confirm that Jacob had been under observation throughout the entire night. At dawn, when